Harriet Tubman. They called her the Moses of her people. Called her that because she led so many people out of slavery, like the Moses of old. She led them out on what they called the Underground Railroad. Of course, you understand, it wasn't a real railroad at all. It was a network of people who, like Harriet, believed that it was okay for slaves to escape from slavery. 90, 100 miles of walking late at night through swamps, through woods, been chased by dogs sometime. And don't you know, sometimes people would get scared and want to go back, but Harriet, she always kept a 6-shooter strapped to her side underneath her skirt. When they got to getting nervous and scared, she'd pull that 6-shooter out and say, all right, you move on or you'll die. And everybody would move on. She brought over 300 people out of slavery like that on the Underground Railroad and never lost a passenger.
Harriet Tubman was born Harriet Ross around 1820. Her exact birthday isn't known because, like many slaves, her date of birth was never recorded. She lived with her parents and 10 brothers and sisters on a plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland. When Harriet was 5 years old, she was hired out as a domestic servant. She slept on the kitchen floor, poking her feet under the fireplace ashes when the nights grew cold. For meals, she shared table scraps with her master's dogs.
Actual slavery was economic, it was legal, it was personal. It was a situation in which the slave had no rights. A person who was a slave could not walk down the next block without having someone else who owned her or who owned him say explicitly, yes, you may do that. A slave was someone who could be forced to work from the age of 8, 6, 4 even, long hours at tasks that someone else decided.
Young Harriet repeatedly failed at domestic work, and by the time she was in her early teens, was known as a strong but surly laborer, unfit for indoor work, yet useful as a field hand. She could plow, chop wood, and drive a team of oxen more efficiently than most men.
She worked on the farm like the men, hoeing and planting and plowing and that kind of work. And her overseer would whip her every day. Every day she would get whipped.
She had to be more or less obedient to her master. They told her when to go to bed, when to get up, when to work and such. And she had a rebellious spirit, and she said that slavery was against the law of God.
In 1831, when Harriet was about 11, Nat Turner, a slave on a Virginia plantation, led an army of 60 rebel slaves against their white masters.
The slaves are known to have used protests virtually from their time of departure from the slave castles on the African West Coast primarily, in which they resisted the attempt to be enslaved, to become enslaved. They attempted to escape on ships by simply, if the opportunity offered itself, by leaping off and drowning or whatever. Once they were bound by the continental United States, the protest took the form more of insurrection, slaves fighting against the system, and they fought against the system whether they were in the North or the South.
I'm gonna cross the rivers of Jordan. I'm gonna cross the rivers of Jordan some of these days. Hallelujah, I'm gonna cross the rivers of Jordan. Tell God how you treating some of these days.
When Harriet was 15 years old, her compassionate nature proved to have disastrous results.
Because she had chosen to block the door when there was an attempt to capture a runaway slave and she herself was placed in the way of a 2-pound weight which struck her head and which undoubtedly fractured her skull and left her with some sort of affliction.
Harriet fell into a coma and endured a long period of recovery.
As I lay so sick on my bed from Christmas to March, I was always praying for poor old master. Oh, Lord, convert old master. Change that man's heart and make him a Christian.
She suffered periodic sleeping fits for the rest of her life as a result of this injury. In 1844, Harriet married John Tubman, a free black man, but this did not change Harriet's status as a slave. Her husband, like her masters, wanted to control her, threatening that if she were to run away, he would betray her. In 1849, Tubman's worst fears came true. She heard that 2 of her sisters had been sold and were already in chains heading south.
Then I heard that as soon as I was able to move, I was to be sent with my brothers in a chain gang to the far south.
Harriet knew it was time to go, and she persuaded 3 of her brothers to go with her. Her father had shown her how to use the night sky as a compass. She assured her brothers that she could guide them. Harriet Tubman knew better than to ask her husband to come along, or even to let him know that she was going. She left at night with her brothers, but fearing the unknown, they insisted on turning back. Harriet turned back with them. Harriet learned through another slave that she was scheduled to be sold south the next day. This time she knew she would have to run away alone. She had learned an important lesson which she would never forget. Freedom is only for those bold enough to take it. Not able to trust her husband, Tubman wanted someone in her family to know she was leaving on her own, that she was not on her way south.
She walked by the big house where her sister was working and started singing, "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. I ain't got long to stay here." So Mary Ann got the message, and she knew what the message was.
They would use coded messages to slave spirituals. As I said, walk together, children, don't become weary. We're going to make it to the promised land. I have shoes, you have shoes, all God's children have shoes. When you get to heaven, going to put on their shoes and walk all over God's heaven. Heaven was a code word for Canada.
When night fell, a stranger hid Tubman in the back of his farm wagon, covered her with vegetables, and drove her to the first stop on the Underground Railroad. She began to learn the route she was to use so often and so effectively in the future. The Underground Railroad was a loose network of people willing to hide runaway slaves in their homes and conduct them to the next station or safe house. Traveling by night, hiding in the daylight, Tubman trudged through 90 miles of swamp and woodland. At last, many days after she started, she found herself across the magic line on free soil.
I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now that I was free. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven.
Making her way to Philadelphia, Harriet was able to get a job in a hotel kitchen. The city had an active abolitionist community.
The Philadelphia Vigilance Committee was a very important group engaged in aiding fugitive slaves. It was a group that had operated from the late 1830s into the early 1840s, and it was comprised of fugitives as well as free blacks and white supporters. It was a group that aided the Underground Railroad, and their primary job was to aid fugitives with food and clothing and money, and to direct them on to other places. When Harriet Tubman arrived in Philadelphia, she affiliated herself with this group, and this group supported her in her return to Maryland and the Eastern Shore to free other fugitives.
Usually when slaves arrive with Harriet Tubman, for instance, the Johnson house or any other house along the Freedom Trail, the first thing she would do, she would give a soft knock on the door, and usually there was the answer, "Who's there?" "A friend with a friend." It was the coded words. Then the occupant would know that Harriet Tubman was there, or another conductor in the underground were slaves. And the password was given, and the passwords were returned.
So Harriet Tubman is someone who, through her own devices, through her own exertion, overcame slavery, became free, and then even more so, went back and brought other people with her. So she has freedom, 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 freedom.
Harriet made many trips south, but by 1851, the Fugitive Slave Act made these trips all the more dangerous. Tubman heard ominous news of fugitive slaves arrested and returned to the South from previously safe cities in Massachusetts and New York.
I never closed my eyes that I did not imagine that I saw the horsemen coming and heard the screams of women and children as they were being dragged away.
Philadelphia was no longer a safe place for Harriet to work. She moved to St. Catharines, Canada, a small town near Niagara Falls, where many free blacks and former slaves had settled. Now, instead of 90 miles, she had to conduct her passengers on a grueling journey of almost 500 miles.
She stole away into the night and crept along the various slave quarters or cabins, oftentimes whispering or knocking on doors, more or less singing, steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. I ain't got long to stay here, was a coded spiritual informing the slaves to steal away.
She was a very courageous and brave woman, as she, in turn escaped from slavery and then went back to help others do the same. So she, even in the early stages, she was giving back to her, you could call her community. She was helping her brothers and sisters get to where she had already gotten.
By 1854, Harriet Tubman had become a legend among the slaves and a demon to the slaveholders. Posters announced a reward for Harriet Tubman, sometimes called Moses, worth $12,000 to any person who delivered her to the authorities. The countryside swarmed with bounty hunters. In 1857, Tubman settled down in Auburn, New York. The small town was to be Tubman's home for the rest of her life. Before emancipation, she would make 19 excursions into the South, delivering more than 300 slaves, including family, from the land that had tried and failed to keep her in bondage. It was on these pilgrimages that she met Frederick Douglass and John Brown, leaders in the Abolitionist movement. John Brown recruited a small band of free blacks and fugitive slaves for an attack on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. What he needed now was black leadership, charismatic figures who could inspire and lead these volunteers. He believed there were two such leaders in the United States, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. During the winter of 1858 and 59, Tubman met with John Brown and others in Boston to confer about the plans at Harper's Ferry.
Harriet Tubman would have been with John Brown at Harper's Ferry had she not become ill at the time. And so therefore, I think that the course of history was changed, perhaps, by her illness.
Brown's efforts failed. He was captured, tried, and executed.
after the Harper's Ferry raid was a failure, Harriet Tubman, like many other African-American abolitionists, had to distance herself from Brown and from the raid because her name, like that of Douglass and many others, was bantered around as one of those who was supportive and involved in the raid indirectly.
As the North-South split widened, the South called for strict enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and an end to the Underground Railroad.
There were many people who didn't like the idea that the Underground Railroad was existing at all. Black people and white people, there were black spies and white spies who would sell their soul for $5 for a bottle of liquor or whatever to reveal the hiding places of these fugitive slaves.
The issue of slavery continued to divide the Union. 7 states in the South withdrew from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. The Civil War had begun.
We mourn not that the man should toil. 'Tis nature's need, 'tis God's decree. But let the hand that tills the soil be like the wind that fans it free.
As Union troops advanced through Maryland in the spring and summer of 1861, large numbers of slaves left their plantations to join the Northern soldiers. These contrabands, many of them illiterate, malnourished, and ill, flooded the Union Army camps. Overwhelmed, Union Army commanders sent out a call for teachers and nurses. Hundreds of Northerners responded, among them Harriet Tubman. Aware of her work on the Underground Railroad, Union officers sometimes used her to lead spy missions.
She was called to lead a group of soldiers because she knew the elements, the forests, the swamps, and so forth. So she led them into a small skirmish, and she was able to retrieve valuable information during that period for the Union Army.
Later that year, Tubman accepted an assignment to lead a force of 150 black soldiers and 3 steam-powered gunboats up the Combahee River. They destroyed Confederate munitions and supplies, and in the process freed 800 slaves. To Tubman's credit, no one was killed or even hurt. She would continue to perform this important work until the war ended, almost 2 years later.
She was not formally employed. She was informally employed, but that was not unusual at that time. Many others were also. So she was neither paid during the war, and after the war, she did not receive it. The government turned her down. And it meant then that for many years, and particularly as she got older, that she became poverty-stricken. And had it not been for the National Association of Colored Women, who, when finding out about her condition, had a national campaign to raise monies to aid her, and indeed they did until her death. This is one of the tragedies of American history, that it refused to recognize the singular services of an American patriot like Harriet Tubman.
When Tubman returned to her home in Auburn, she was about 45 years old, penniless and responsible for 2 aged parents. She planted apple trees and broke ground for a large vegetable garden to feed her family and anyone who came to her door.
After the Civil War, Harriet Tubman settled in Auburn, New York, where she became very active in aiding other African Americans. In many of the communities of the North, like Auburn, you had a number of blacks who were very poor. Many of them worked as laborers. Some of them could not get work. But there was a real problem in that period because institutions for the aged, institutions for delinquents, orphans, and others were not readily available to African Americans. She determined that she would set up a home for the aged there in her own home, and indeed she did.
Appearing at her door in 1869 was another visitor, a tall, handsome man named Nelson Davis. Tubman had met him at a South Carolina Army base. The former soldier asked the former spy to marry him. Despite their age difference of 24 years, she accepted. At about this time, Sarah Bradford began writing Harriet's biography. It was first printed in 1869 under the title Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. Bradford published the book, then turned its proceeds, some $1,200, over to Tubman.
Harriet Tubman was able to escape from slavery herself, returned to slave territory numerous times, helped hundreds of other slaves to escape, and has been called the Moses of her people in the terms of leading the slaves out of slavery into freedom. And she lived a very long and fruitful life, and I think is a shining example of the kinds of things that women were able to achieve under very difficult circumstances.
On March 10th, 1913, Harriet Tubman died of pneumonia at the age of 93.
I came back to Auburn on this beautiful green evergreen tree that shades her grave in a silent cemetery, and I broke down. My emotional armor broke down, and I cried. And I said to myself, how did this woman do it? How did she lead 300 passengers to freedom and never lost one on the Underground Railroad?
I have wrought in the day, you in the night. I have had the applause of the crowd and the satisfaction that comes from being approved by the multitude, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scarred, and footsore bondmen and women, whom you have led out of the house of bondage, and whose heartfelt "God bless you" has been your only reward.